I feel after that I should nail my colours to the mast slightly, and what kind of biographer am I? I'm obviously working very much in a literary field, literary criticism. I do not claim anything like perfect knowledge. My angle on Lawrence has been through the friendship he had with the art curator H.S. Eade. That's sort of the area I'm most interested in, and I have a very text-centred approach to this, so I'm working outwards as much as possible from the Mint and from those surviving letters. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and as I say, it's sort of an, imperfect knowledge, but hopefully enlightening in some way. So I'm talking today about Lawrence's chronicle of life in the 1920s RAF, the Mint, and I'm going to be talking about it as a book intimately bound up with Lawrence's wartime experience. I'd like to suggest that the book both charts and is in itself Lawrence's attempt to work through trauma sustained in conflict. To do that, I'll be outlining why I think we need to expand our consideration of what a post-war book might be, before arguing that Lawrence's sense of self was so compromised by his roles, both active and passive, in the Arab Revolt, that he sought in his post-war life both to forget that existence and build himself a new identity. For him, the ranks of the RAF presented themselves as the ideal place in which to undertake that work, either consciously or perhaps subconsciously, I should add. And I'll be looking at the text of the Mint in detail to offer an analysis of that process, a sort of literary analysis. So, the case for reviewing World War I legacy to include texts like the Mint. We've been mostly talking today, and we'll be mostly talking about Seven Pillars as the war book. And in that conversation, we're sort of talking about the shift from the received memory of World War I as a battle of muddy trenches, shell shock, noise, tear gas, to a very different order of war trauma. I think for men of Lawrence's generation, this is sort of caught up with the idea of a kind of psychopathology of empire as well. I think that's not quite so foregrounded in the trenches, though of course it is there. And I'd like to sort of expand our thinking of trauma, not only spatially, from the Somme to Syria, but also chronologically and thematically. And my point of departure for this idea is the quotation from the English historian Eric Hobsbawm about that generation, that war generation, which is, peace meant before 1914. After that came something that no longer deserved the name. So I think if we take a very strict chronological view of what counts as post-war or war writing, that's going to be very restrictive for us. And I think at the very least we need to consider anything written during the lifespan of those who experienced the First World War as post-war, or at least potentially post-war. I'm not claiming everything written in that lifetime is post-war, but I think we need to entertain the possibility. And I think given our understandings of trauma in general and post-traumatic stress disorder in particular, it also stands to reason that the most interesting and enlightening post-war writing might appear quite a long time after the event. After all, we know that PTSD can surface at any time, and this is just what happened to one of Lawrence's friends, Jim Eade, who I mentioned, in 1928. Eade was an assistant at the Tate Art Gallery when the Thames burst its banks at Lambeth. Nearby homes were destroyed, and 14 people were drowned. The Tate's lower galleries were flooded, and Eade battled hard to save paintings from the waters, and they lost about 18 paintings, and he was working through the night, and he had water up to his knees, and it was dark and it was chaotic. This disaster seems to have awakened wartime fears and horrors encrypted within Jim Eade, and he later wrote that, "I think I was more or less all the time in the war. At night my subconscious self was awake and on sentry go, and I was afraid to relax for fear of a surprise attack. The flood brought it all to the surface." And I've italicized those words. Very interesting choice of words, and it's a very obvious image of the flood, things actually literally coming up to the surface. Lawrence sympathized with this, and he observed that as the war gets more distant, it gets more horrible, truly. At the time we did not feel it as hardly as we do now. And then he goes on to say, "Yet I think the change is in ourselves, not in the war. Blame your illness rather upon doing too many things. Book writing is the world's most exhausting toil." Don't know how many people in the room might agree with that. And I think what's interesting about this is not so much Lawrence's apparent attempt to limit the influence on the war on both him and its troubles. I think the use of the plural is very interesting. And unfortunately, you've got a typo there. That should be our troubles. That's actually quite important. There's our troubles down to the war. I think it's the comment on book writing really interests me. We know a lot about Lawrence's sort of breakdown while he was trying to write Seven Pillars. It's quite obvious that this act of writing is distressing and exhausting. And I think we need to think about both of Lawrence's single-authored books as inextricably linked with his wartime experience. So, very, very broad strokes of what exactly Lawrence's wartime trauma might have been. I know we're going to hear a lot of papers discussing this in depth, so I don't want to go into this in too much detail. But as I say, this is sort of caught up with the idea of sort of the psychopathology of empire that men of Lawrence's generation underwent. So we have sort of his own sort of cited areas of distress, so his role as a betrayer, this idea, and then the irony that comes from being identified with the traditional imperialism which he opposed. The long dialogue we have with power, the idea of being seduced by it and also terrified by his own delight in power, and this revulsion from adulation, and there's sort of deep-seated ideas about unworthiness, which I've suggested there is born of treachery, and treachery we can interpret very widely, both the sort of act of suggesting to the Arabs that they were going to get something that they're not going to get, but also betrayal of the body in the rape, and sort of treachery in all its colours there. So, in short, this is a sort of a self-disgust. And so, for Lawrence, I'm thinking this sort of idea of seeking refuge from an identity that he'd helped to create, but was becoming increasingly alienated from. The problem for Lawrence, as I'm suggesting here, is one of how to be in the world. And one answer to that problem is to both change the perception of being and the perception of the world. So both need to change. So we come to a potential solution, which is to join the ranks of the RAF. As Jeremy Wilson noted, in Lawrence's own words, this is the idea of to seek a sanctuary, to seek a haven in what is essentially a closed and self-contained world, and dissolve an unsatisfactory individual self in a group identity. And then perhaps this gives the space, that mental space, your thinking time is your own, in which to work through wartime trauma. Oh, not quite there yet. The general process that's put forward in the Mint is that the Air Force breaks men down first, before remaking them in its own image. So, it stands to reason that this might be a chance for Lawrence to fundamentally alter his sense of self. In the early chapters of the Mint, this is expressed through both metaphors of death and rebirth, and the idea that entering into the service is to enter into another world. And this is encapsulated in the focus on the gate in chapter 2. There's a long discussion of sort of passing through from civilian life through the gate into the closed world of the RAF. The three-part structure of the Mint also suggests a process of refashioning. The first section is named the raw material, the second in the mill, and the third service. But I think we're being sort of slightly led astray by these sort of literary markers. I think there are problems with accepting the idea that Lawrence is somehow being remade by an outside force. I think it's actually a lot more active than that. I don't think he's sort of submitting himself to something as much as the text of the Mint might suggest. I think what he's doing in the RAF is in fact throwing his own self outwards into a sanctuary which is actually partly of his own design. It doesn't just exist independently of him. He has actually played an active role in forming the boundaries of the sanctuary. And in doing so, he can dissolve himself into a corporate identity, which he infuses with an almost divine purpose in the Mint. So this is a very typical passage. It talks about the sight of flying would hearten us as a reminder of our profession to help conquer the air. We are vowed to this enterprise as a corporate effort in which no more names can be preeminent, but success will visit the joined hands of 1,000,000 obscure, to win the freehold of the upper element in as much measure as man's licence on land or a sailor's liberty at sea. So a very profound use of very heightened language. This is this is an enterprise of the glory of the air, and I think as important to this sort of lived solution, as it were, is to reflect on the process which is being undergone, which is a slight twist on what Lawrence said he wanted to do when he entered the RAF. In 1922, he told Hugh Trenchard that he wanted to join the ranks of airmen in order that he might write about the new force. The barracks were to be the means and the book the end product. However, it didn't end up being quite that simple. And in the Mint, Lawrence does not just write the RAF. Increasingly, we find that the RAF is also writing him. This working through, therefore, becomes a dialectal process. And it's as facile to say the Mint is a documentary of service life as to say Seven Pillars is a history of the Eastern Theatre of World War I. They are both those things, but they're both in fact bound up with the protean shifting selves that were Lawrence and the man Lawrence wanted to be, or the self he wanted to be. So a little bit on the background of the Mint. He began writing the second work in the RAF barracks, having enlisted under the pseudonym John Hume Ross in 1922. And the timing of that, he's still very, very involved in reworking Seven Pillars, thinking about publication, thinking about abridgment. So these things are happening at the same time. This isn't something that happens after Seven Pillars, it's happening at the same time. It was written, so Lawrence tells us, as a series of notes on life in the ranks, scribbled down in off-duty moments and later compiled in various arrangements to create what Lawrence called a skeleton of a book. The dominant theme of the book is this attempt to assume a collective identity, or we could say a doomed quest for belonging. I'm saying doomed because in the Mint, the writer is always separated by one means or another from the group he writes about. I mean, that is in a sense inevitable when we come to write. There's always going to be that separation. I think it's interesting how it works in the Mint. And this sort of idea of a fatal flaw in the plan, such as it was, is amplified by the fact that the Mint is in essence an oblique form of autobiography. One cannot hope to lose self-consciousness by writing about the self. Lawrence, as you'd expect, is fully aware of this, commenting in the Mint that it's as hard by thinking to take an inch of our complexity as add an L. So I want to turn now to that idea of the sort of the group identity in the Mint. This project to describe the group that Lawrence both does and does not belong to. There's frequent shifts between modes of discourse in the novel, the autobiography, between I, we, and they, and sometimes even within just a few lines. So this section, he's talking about the men are all in church and they're having a sort of very draconian sermon preached to them. So that's the he of the first line is the priest. And who says he aims so crooked too when he tries to convict our party of sin, and yet in the very next sentence we have they are yet happy, being innocent of the reflection which creates a sense of sin. And so you've got that sort of very quick flip between sort of being in the group and outside the group, and this is further complicated by a sort of anthropological third person, which sort of blends into free and direct discourse in the book. So here he is describing breakfast. He says, give to a table 12 spindly brine-sodden rashers and a tin of stale eggs, and 12 men will roll out of mess deck, that's dining hall, ripe feeling and full, with praise of the messing officer, bon our bacon and eggs. Well, who is saying bon our bacon and eggs? It seems to be Lawrence reporting what he imagines the feelings of the group to be. So there's sort of several layers of removal and confusion there. And so who this we represents is Slippery, Sometimes it appears to be voicing Lawrence's thoughts, and sometimes it's clearly not. I think we can make a distinction between the we Lawrence uses sort of on duty, that's the we of training, drill, punishment. This is a more truly collective voice, which is associated with the spirit of the RAF, as I showed you earlier in the talk. By contrast, we also have a sort of off-duty we, which appears to be more ironical, bomb our bacon and eggs. And this seems to be one in which Lawrence struggles to find a place. But both are contradictory. And the collective we, I think, may be just a pure fabrication. It may not actually exist at all. So if it is a fabrication, I think this brings us up against a very interesting parallel with Seven Pillars. Just as Lawrence has received growing criticism and profound criticism in some quarters for speaking for the Arabs, at times in the Mint, he seems to co-opt the we of the RAF with the impression of giving the voice to the voiceless, but actually what he might be doing is silencing them further. There's a whole post-colonial discourse we could talk about attached to that. So for, just to take one example of many, he talks about wanting to be a squad. He says, we want to be a squad, not individuals. Is he articulating the collective wish of himself and his fellow recruits, or imposing his own feelings about what he has termed the minting process on them? I think another problem in comparison with the Seven Pillars is the problem of extrapolation. We know that from a very specific group of desert Arabs, Lawrence extrapolates a view, a very idealised view of what an Arab should be. When we know most of them are sort of living an urban existence, most of the Arabs in the old Ottoman Empire area did not necessarily relate to this ideal Arab that we're given. We also have an ideal serviceman in the RAF, and the ideal airman is that one, this one, the happy, innocent, innocent of reflection. So it's a young man, perhaps not overly given to introspection, very earnest, very rough and ready, and this is the ideal serviceman we're presented with in the Mint. But these are not character portraits. This is a very much a kind of universalised view, and I think falsely universalising. It's a problem that also extends to the RAF itself. It emerges through Lawrence's letters that the RAF is not actually being written about as a thing, as an entity. It's very much Lawrence's RAF. For example, during his second posting, he writes that the camp is not the sort of RAF I want to write about. So what is the sort of RAF he wants to write about? If this camp that he's in at the time doesn't fit the bill, what's he going to do about that? So it begs the question of what and where is the RAF what Lawrence wants to write about, and leaves us in no doubt that the RAF of the Mint is, even more than would necessarily be the case in the work of literature, Lawrence's own creation. So this brings us to the idea of the RAF as the self-made sanctuary. He doesn't just escape from the world into another one that's ready and waiting for him. Just as we have a problem in the sort of, well, perhaps a problem in the idea of the fabricated collective voice, this sanctuary is to a large degree self-made. For example, he could not have enlisted in the ranks at all without the assistance of friends in high places, much less give a false name in recruitment. That's an imprisonable offence. And unlike his fellow recruits, by special arrangement, Lawrence could have left at any time. He wasn't in there for 7 years. He could have gone whenever he liked. Arnold Lawrence had plenty to say about this. This again is to Jim Eade from 1944. And he's sort of taking issue with what Eade thinks of as Lawrence's apparent selflessness in sort of giving himself over to service. And he says that he could have enlisted in the RAF at any time he wanted to. He could have been an officer in the RAF however he wanted to be. He could have done jobs that were suited to his physical capability at the time, and that his presence in the ranks made life for his superiors incredibly difficult. And the second part of that quotation says, I have heard arguments put forward by decent officers under whom he served that his anomalous position was not merely unfair to his officers, but bad for the service. So, Lawrence was only able to access this very bespoke version of life at the bottom of the pile because he started so near the top. This means that his career in the Air Force was never straightforwardly about the abnegation of a self in service, because ironically, its existence depended on who he was. His previous existence is hinted at throughout the Mint and bubbles up to the surface all the time. He hints at it. One of the recruits finds his birth certificate and he sort of hastily hides it away. And he talks about removing his own portrait from the mess deck. So there's a portrait of Colonel Lawrence up where they all eat, and he sneaks in and sort of takes it off the wall. So Aircraftman Ross is dependent on Colonel Lawrence. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves then is, if Lawrence joined the RAF as a way of working through wartime trauma, is what's actually happening a distraction from that work? Is it an aid, or is it something else? And it's clear that Lawrence craved the institutionalised existence of the RAF as the buffer against a chaotic inner life. And the comfort he seems to have drawn from his service can be compared to the security that many sufferers of depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder find in a regular pattern of activity. People still regularly join the military as a way to cope with OCD and related disorders, because that routine can be very helpful for them. It seems that sleeping, eating and working in an environment in which one did not so much have to decide as serve, provided him, in a very real sense, with a lifeline and an opportunity to dissolve his individual self in that collective identity. However, the I still exists. The Mint is not purely written in the collective at all. It sort of pops up all over the place, and it doesn't get less frequent as we go through the book. It's profoundly fragmentary. I think one critic identified the I as being split between intellect, spirit, flesh, and the I that's actually writing the novel. That's just one way in which you can split it up. It's also contradictory. He admits in The Odd Man Out that he is miserable in the depot. I think there's, and he's frightened of what happens when he'll leave. I think this is very key. He says, don't remind us yet of that bad time, i.e. when we have to leave the RAF. For 7 years we are rid of it. He also says that he doesn't know what kind of person he's going to be when he comes out of the RAF. He says we are no nearer knowing whether the new 50 will be their ancient selves or microcosms of the flight than we were on that first day. So he's not quite sure how he's going to be. And there's this sort of very sad letter he wrote to Ede just before he was discharged. He says, if I find myself in possession of a quiet mind, then I shall be fortunate. I think I shall have to draw this mind when I draw my discharge. I dare only hope that I find it full and quiet. If we do think of the RAF life as a kind of working through in work and on paper, perhaps that's a working through that cannot ever truly be completed. Ede reflected after Lawrence's death that he thought his friend was almost coming through the war, almost, and that's 20 years after the conflict ended. I think these quotations about the fear of leaving the RAF also show an uneasy expectation that the self that Lawrence wanted to transform, or have transformed for him, has in fact only been put into abeyance, and an imperfect abeyance. You know, he sort of was, as we know, he was sort of outed at various times during his service. He wrote, both in the Mint and in private letters, that the RAF had become his nature, as in he had become, his own self had become indivisible from the RAF. But I think we can infer that this only remained true as long as he stayed in the RAF. The Mint ends with Lawrence's wish, vain as it turned out, that he might never have to write the end to his service life. As he said to Jim Ede, I do not often confess it to people, but I'm always aware that madness lies very near me, always. The RAF's solidity and routine have been anchors holding me to life and the world. I wish they did not have to be cut. We can only speculate what would have happened if those anchors did not have to be cut. But he never did draw his quiet mind, and the outside world was waiting for him very brutally on his release. So, can such a flawed mode of experience properly be thought of as a working through of trauma, or is it a distraction? I think it can, because to say that this work is contradictory and complex is not to say that it's built on bad faith. I think it would be wrong to suggest that Lawrence's life as aircraftsman Ross was a kind of play acting. If anything, the knowledge that he could leave the RAF at any time made it harder for him and did nothing to curb his obsession with testing the strength of his own will. After all, staying the course was for him not a matter of necessity, but a decision that must be made afresh every day, as you've written in the autobiography, Jeremy. So what we're left with is a paradox that mirrors the production of the Mint itself. Lawrence wrote that he'd tried out a number of techniques for ordering the notes he'd taken for his book, including at one point taking scissors to the text and rendering it as a sort of Dadaist cut-up. So on the one hand, Lawrence announces the Mint as a set of notes, implying that we must refrain from looking for too much coherence in the book, and yet we know from Lawrence's letters that he was also actively experimenting with ideas of modernist disjointedness. So we have an interplay between apparent authenticity, i.e. the cutting up, i.e. the making of the notes, and self-conscious constructiveness, i.e. the experimentation and the cutting up of those notes and very deliberately playing with their form. And I think this forms a parallel with Lawrence's lived experience in the RAF ranks. I'm not very sure about this phrase, but at the moment I'm talking about it as sincere artifice. A will to live honestly that requires an honest contemplation of the limits of such an approach. The construction of this new life on the page and as experience was built on a foundation that Lawrence tried to escape but ultimately never would be able to. Thank you very much.